Good morning, everyone. Welcome back. This morning's panel is entitled Valuing Species, Is There Need for Endangered Species Act Reform? And our introducer and moderator this morning is Tom Jensen of Sunshine, Nash, and Rosenthal. And welcome.
Good morning, everybody. Last year, when I stood before this conference, I started it by having the one contact lens on the one eye of mine that works pop out. And I was blind for an hour giving a presentation on energy policy. And I've worked that material for a whole year, for sympathy, for humor. But I'm hoping nothing like that dramatic happens here this morning, or at least that the only drama is in the intellect and the fire from our panelists. It's 8:30. Let's get going, guys. We're going to raise the bar. Let me begin by thanking the School of Law, Dean Eck, Mike, and Jennifer for running a great conference on, well, when you have a huge budget and staff, you can do anything. So I shouldn't give them too much credit. Elizabeth Kronk, thank you for not being here and opening this slot for me to moderate this panel. We're going to talk to you about the Endangered Species Act. But I think the place to start, despite what you've heard from the panelists yesterday, I think the place to start is with hope. And it's a theme for this election season, but it's also, I think, where we ought to begin in thinking about the future of the Endangered Species Act. And I think we need to cling to that tightly as we go forward. Here's my thesis. Roughly 40 years ago, the slate of modern environmental law became modern environmental law. It was Clean Water Act, Endangered Species reforms, NEPA, other things emerged into political life. And they enjoyed about 10 years of infancy, maybe toddlerhood, before the Reagan Revolution did its best to smother them in the cradle. And for the last 30 years or so, the laws that were enacted under the leadership of Mo Udall, Scoop Jackson, John Dingell, and others, with important leadership from Richard Nixon, have basically limped along in a political era of great unfriendliness to innovation, to implementation, to enforcement. These are laws that have labored under extraordinarily adverse conditions because of the overall political environment in the country. That overall political environment is changing as rapidly as it has in virtually any season. I think John Lessie's comments suggested the last time things have swung as dramatically. And what I think that means is that laws that look like horrible messes, legal regimes that look unalterably complex, that look truly Gordian in their interweavings, actually are entering a time when innovation, when creativity will have another shot at it. We'll get a chance to pull some of those threads loose and examine them again and see how they fit together. That is my thesis of hope, and we're going to need that hope as we go forward here, because here's what we're looking at. I don't know where you were at 8:38 a.m. on Tuesday, September the 2nd, but I was printing this document, and this is a report, this is a summary that reads a little bit like a airport novel book jacket cover from the interagency analysis, the synthesis report overseen by EPA on various studies, pieces of science collected among the federal agencies about climate. This is one of a series of reports they're putting out under the general heading of synthesis reports. Here's the headline: Climate change. Report warns of possibility that warming could push ecosystems across thresholds. A report from your government warns of the threat of climate change pushing ecosystems across thresholds that would lead to their rapid destruction. The report says federal resource managers may have to adapt to climate change and abandon goals of preserving ecosystems in their historic state because climate change may render those goals unachievable. According to the report, even slight warming may push ecosystems across thresholds that would render restoration extremely difficult or impossible. It makes simple observations such as it recommends that resource managers reduce other environmental stressors that may reduce the threat of crossing thresholds. And these stressors include air and water pollution, regional landscape fragmentation, and the control of invasive plants. Managers may also have to reconsider the species carrying capacity of given parcels of land, minimum habitat sizes, and the water needs of a given ecosystem. And they should work to protect impacts to water supply, biodiversity, resource extraction, et cetera. That's your government, that's the Bush administration telling you what climate change is bringing to the public lands. And it is the agenda for those of you who are in law school today thinking about environmental law, practicing in natural resources, worrying about public lands. This is the thesis that will define the careers of the next generation of environmental lawyers. The whippersnappers, as they were summoned up yesterday. Let me introduce our panel of whippersnappers here. This is our diversity slate here, folks. We are joined by some of the most distinguished and accomplished practitioners in the field of Endangered Species Act, public lands law, and natural resources. These folks know what they're talking about. Dale Goebel is a professor of law at the University of Idaho. He is teaching this year at my alma mater, Lewis and Clark Law School, and enjoying a year in Portland, Oregon. He is rated by the website Rate My Professor as a 0 for hotness. Numbers. He is the Margaret Wilson Shimke Distinguished Professor of Law. To be clear, he teaches natural resources, wildlife law, environmental legal history, and torts, none of which will come to pass today, we are hoping. He is widely published on the topic of the Endangered Species Act and is leading a fascinating multi-year, multi-part process called ESA at 30. He will lead us off. He'll be followed by Steve Quarles. Steve Quarles and I are both alumni of the Senate Energy Committee. We are inheritors of Scoop Jackson's legacy in that respect. Steve has represented industry and commercial interests on public lands matters for years. He's one of the people who knows these laws and how they work and how they don't work from the industry side better than just about anybody else you'll ever confront. He's got more than war stories. He's got a very long-term perspective on how the Endangered Species Act is evolving and needs to evolve as we go forward. Jack Tucholsky is one of yours. He's a distinguished graduate, a son of Montana, and one of the most accomplished environmental litigators in the Northern Rockies. He has made very important law across this ecosystem. For his sins, he is being sent to Slovenia for a year, courtesy of the Fulbright grant, and he will bring a contrasting perspective, I think, to Mr. Quarles. On balance, as we prepared, though, I should say this, as we prepared for this panel, what we found is a remarkable continuity and overlap of view on what the law has done, what it does well, where it needs to change. And with that, let me hand you off to Professor Goebel, 0 for hotness.
Yeah, right. Here we go.
You can spill your water on me.
Yeah, on the way back, I think. You know. Well, I was going to say it was good to be here, but I'm no longer sure that it was good to be here. But anyway, I had actually been going to start off this morning by saying that I hoped everyone had read their homework assignment in the materials. But then I looked at the materials and realized that they, after the transmission over here, were illegible. I'm on sabbatical in Portland, and I presume that the problem was sending something from a blue state to a red state. You just can't read it. They don't work crossing those kind of boundaries, I think. Is that sufficiently hopeful for you?
That is hopeful.
Okay, good. If you had been able to read the materials, you would know that I think that the ESA is controversial, not because it's a pit bull, since the Act's teeth have been fairly significantly and methodically blunted over the last 30-odd years. I don't think it's a pit bull, but I think it's controversial because it sits on a cusp of the fundamental societal divide that this country faces, that maybe we're going to get beyond if things are, in fact, as hopeful as some hope. The ESA embodies a fairly simple sort of ethical proposition. Our species has a responsibility to conserve other species with which we share this planet. That makes the Act a lightning rod for those that think that decisions ought to be based either on an economic or a theological metric. And in the current highly partisan political environment, controversy produces a lot of spin. One of the most common things about the ESA is the argument that it's a failure. So I was happy to see in the Public Policy Research Institute's report what I think is an accurate statement, which is that the ESA has been successful in safeguarding species. That's the place that I think that all of us on the panel begin. The Act has not been a failure. The fact that it hasn't been a failure, of course, doesn't mean that it can't be improved. Also, what another surprising thing I think that you will discover is that there is substantial agreement, fairly widespread consensus on a number of things that could be done that would improve the Act. For example, a common one that's cited is the designation of critical habitat. It would be much better to do that at the recovery planning stage than at the listing stage. So moving the designation of critical habitat later into the process would be a significant step. Also, I, like everybody else who seems to spend too much time wandering around inside the ESA, I have some pet proposals as well. I think, for example, that recovery plans ought to be evidence of the best available science when you're doing consultation and similar kinds of decisions that are supposed to be based on best available science. I also think that the procedural complexity of the listing, delisting, downlisting process ought to be significantly changed. Most of the procedures are not designed to get at science. They're to give people an opportunity to jump up and down and to slow the agency process. So I think if we're going to base decisions on science, that we don't need anywhere near as many procedures to get there. Controversy and partisanship, however, make amendments to the ESA vanishingly small. The probability of that is vanishingly small. In 1997, for example, there was a bipartisan and moderate bill that failed. 2006, there was a distinctly less bipartisan bill that also failed. I think that attempting to amend the ESA is essentially the kiss of death. So I don't think there's really any chance that the ESA is going to be amended in the foreseeable future, particularly given the current economic meltdown that we're going through. As Bruce Babbitt and John Leshy demonstrated, however, the Act is sufficiently flexible to allow much to be done administratively. If we're going to improve the Act and perhaps reduce controversy, there are a number of sort of small steps that could be taken. I think after having done the ESA at 30 project, I tend to liken it to confidence-building steps. Okay, they always talk about Palestinians and Israelis doing small things to build confidence, and I think that the divide on the ESA can be sort of begun to be bridged anyway by doing similar kinds of things. The ESA at 30 project, which has been alluded to, was this multi-year, multi-interest, multidisciplinary examination of the Endangered Species Act at 30. Okay, now at 35, it sort of continues. It's one of those projects that doesn't seem to die. One of the recurrent issues that came out of that from almost everybody was a lack of transparency. One commenter, who shall go unnamed at this point, has said, as a matter of fact, that the ESA sanctions nearly secret procedures. There are a number of things that could be done to increase the transparency, which would be useful because the lack of transparency fuels litigation. If you don't think you can trust the agency to be doing what the science says, or following its own procedures, then litigation is one of the things that happen frequently. For example, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMFS or NOAA Fisheries, however you want to phrase it, which are the two agencies that administer the ESA, their website databases are inconsistent and they're incomplete. There's no place that you can go to find all of the data on listings and delistings or on any of the science particularly. So there is no generally accessible place to get information on the Act. A more significant way of increasing transparency would be to change or to redefine or narrow the definitions of endangered and threatened. This is something that the agency has the power to do through regulations. The Act's current definitions, endangered means in danger, and threatened means in danger in the foreseeable future, are vague, to be polite, and they lead to inconsistent decisions. There are species on the lists that are far less at risk than species that aren't on the list. So that we have this inconsistency, and inconsistency is another thing that fuels litigation. So an alternative approach is the IUCN approach, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, which has adopted some fairly specific quantitative benchmarks, broken down into 5 or 6 categories. It's not a panacea. One of the things that needs to be understood about the Act is that there are a number of different kinds of uncertainty running around inside of it. One's linguistic. What do we mean by endangered? We could clear up or at least reduce the amount of uncertainty by more carefully defining what we mean by endangered and by threatened. We won't get away from, however, the scientific uncertainty. Most species, when they're listed, there's relatively little known about them. So there's always going to be a level of scientific uncertainty, particularly at the point of listing. By doing away, however, with the arguments about what endangered means, we would at least be focusing the concerns on the relevant stuff. How many of the animals are there? What's happening to their range? How rapidly is the population declining? Those kinds of issues, which would go far, I think, or maybe I'm just being hopeful today, to reducing the amount of litigation and controversy. A closely related issue is improving science. Status determinations and consultations are to be based upon the best available science. The agencies ought to use the powers that they currently have to use consultations and the like to produce additional science. If you're going to do a consultation, the persons or the parties that you're consulting with bring evidence and science to the table, and the agencies ought to capture that science and use it as a way of increasing what they know. Similarly, science is not static. It's like adaptive management, right? It improves with monitoring. Do habitat conservation plans work? What kind of recovery actions work? Is this consultation, will it really produce jeopardy? Or will these offsets change things? All of those kinds of things need to be monitored. But monitoring is the first thing that goes. when budgets are cut, okay, we stop monitoring things. So we're flying in the dark. So if you want to improve science, okay, and everybody, of course, yells, or not, maybe not everybody, but a lot of people yell about junk science and the like. Okay. One way to do that is for the agencies to expect more science from the people that they interact with. There's also broad agreement that the wildlife agencies should involve more conservation partners, states, NGOs, private landowners, and the like. Since we're focused on the public lands here, the primary people or entities that would stand to work with the agencies would be the states. And states have a whole lot to offer. Habitat is central to conservation. At-risk species are at risk primarily because of habitat destruction and modification. It's the single biggest cause of listing. The agencies, the states, pardon me, have the power directly to zone, okay, private lands anyway. They also have more people on the ground. There's more fish and wildlife agents that work for the state than work for the federal government. They're also far more likely to have ongoing relationships with landowners. They're also, particularly in the West, far more likely to be trusted than the feds, who my former congressman used to say arrived in black helicopters. Okay? So the ESA has cooperative federalism provisions that have been underutilized. Just like Section 10 led to habitat conservation plans, safe harbors, and the like, I think that there's a lot of flexibility available in Section 6 that could be used to reshape the federal-state relationship when it comes to endangered species. One example of that kind of a potential is that most species, even when they're recovered, are going to require ongoing conservation management, particularly given what's going to happen with global climate change and how habitat systems are going to fission quite rapidly here. Somebody's going to need, once the population level has been achieved, somebody's going to need to step in and continue to monitor the species and do ongoing habitat things. One example, okay, robin cinquefoil. It's a small member, a member of the rose family. In northern New England. It existed when it was listed in one population, which just happened to be bisected by the Appalachian Trail. One of the significant problems it faced was being trampled by hikers. Okay? It was all national forest land. So the trail was rerouted, okay? A wall was put up, and the Appalachian Trail Club agreed to put a botanist there all summer, okay? So that people would understand not to walk through there. The Forest Service entered into a management agreement with the Fish and Wildlife Service that they would continue to manage the habitat. So those kinds of things are going to be necessary. There you have an NGO, the Appalachian Trail Club. You have the Forest Service agreeing to sort of step in once the population level has been achieved and sort of take over the problem. If I prepared a PowerPoint, okay, unlike some of us, I just, we'll see. I had planned to sort of count down, 10, 9, 8, 7. I would now be at 5, okay? And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 would all be labeled funding. Okay, it is the most significant problem that the Act faced, and it's also the one thing that it seems like everybody agrees on, that the Act needs to be funded. Okay? I'm indebted to Steve for a story that he tells about Michael Bean, who is this master of metaphor. And one way to measure the underfunding of the ESA Michael came up with is that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service entire ESA budget is less than the amount of money that the residents of Washington, D.C. spend on pizza in a year. right? Another measure, okay, is the simple fact that funding on a per species basis peaked in 1978, okay? 30 years ago, we were spending far more per species than we are now. And finally, another measure of the funding problem is that each of the problems that I've talked about, a significant component in each of those problems is funding. For example, recovery is funded at approximately 20% of the money identified in recovery plans. Okay? The mean is 20 cents on the dollar. Now, spending $700 billion to bail out Wall Street means that there's not going to be much money for endangered species, so while I would like to be wildly optimistic, my guess is that the funding problems are with us for the long term.
All right, we're marching bravely into the technological future here with PowerPoint from Steve Quarles. Our apologies on the room layout. It makes it hard to read from back there. But there are copies of this that have been handed out to you this morning and others available outside. Steve?
We truly are marching into the technological future when a Luddite like me tries to do PowerPoint. So as soon as I saw this room and realized that this is a fairly dense text, my secretary tried to reduce an outline to PowerPoint and doesn't understand the true concepts of PowerPoint. I was out of town. That's why I've made sure you all have copies, because nobody at the back of the room can possibly see this, but I still have to do it because it's the only way I can prompt myself on what I'm going to say. So I think we will mesh very well. I think I'll even start off on the pit bull, just as Dale did. I'm going to talk a little bit about how the ESA is unique and some of the problems that creates. I'm going to talk about how its present condition is affected by climate change. And then I am going to talk a little bit about legislative reform. I agree with Dale completely on his basic premise that you can't directly amend the ESA, but I'm going to come up with some other ideas about how we change it. So with that, we begin. The Endangered Species Act may be one of the noblest acts of Congress, and that's act spelled with either a capital A or a small a. And as Dale pointed out, it's often been called the pit bull of environmental laws. I agree with him that that's a misnomer. There have been many questions raised of late as to whether this pit bull is feral or tame. My view, it's a little bit like an immature canine, alternating sudden hormonal rushes with bouts of confusion and inexertion. The condition can best be seen in a comparison with other environmental laws. And I maintain the ESA, and you heard some of it from Dale, is more ambiguous, less understood, suffers from more unresolved issues and anomalies, and behaves differently than other environmental laws. And I'll give you a number of reasons. First is ubiquity. When the ESA was first enacted, most of the private land habitat for species was some distance away from human enterprise or habitation. That's no longer true. I like to say it has become a true interspecies fair housing act. It has unequivocal terms. You won't find language like no best available technology insofar as practicable in the public interest in the ESA as you will in many other environmental laws. As the Supreme Court said in the famous Tellico Dam case, the ESA admits of no exception. Science is supreme in this environmental law. Species listings and other decisions are to be made solely on the basis of the best scientific data available. There's supposed to be no leavening economic or social considerations except for critical habitat designations. But even though science is supreme, we have very weak scientific standard and a big data drought. The key word in the standard is available data. And the species sufficiently at risk to be subject to the ESA are usually few in number and difficult to study, yielding data as scarce as the species themselves. And in Dale's paper, when you can read it, and it helps maybe to hold it about 10 feet away, you will find quotes from the National Research Council study Science in the ESA, which really is frightening about what poor data there really is at the time significant ESA decisions are made. There are ineffective and orphaned provisions, recovery plans. Well, they should be the most important provision in the Act, because those plans are to achieve the basic mission of the Act, which is to recover species. Yet the Act gives those plans no force and effect of law, and they're frequently ignored by all, the services as well as the federal action agencies. Species listings. I reverse it and say when not a species is a species. Under the Act, you can list when it is threatened or endangered in a significant portion of its range. It may be robust in the rest, but if it's threatened or endangered in a significant portion of its range. You can list it if a distinct population segment of any vertebrate species is endangered or threatened. And you can list an experimental population. None of these terms were used or recognized by science or defined by the ESA. Critical habitat. Obviously, the greatest threat to species is the destruction of habitat. And yet, the only major provision in the Act, critical habitat, that relates to habitat, has been the subject of bipartisan disdain. It was labeled useless in congressional hearings by Secretary of the Interior Bruce Babbitt and his Director of Fish and Wildlife Service, Jamie Clark, now with Defenders of Wildlife. And of course, it was seconded by the recent Bush administration. Recent, I keep saying. I can't remember, it's still here. Critical habitats repeal was supported last Congress by polar opposites. Representative Richard Pombo and Representative George Miller, both of them supported repeal of critical habitat. Its replacement or alteration was sought last Congress by Senate chairman and ranking minority members in commissioning the Keystone Center Habitat Working Group that I had the pleasure of being on. And it is racked by equal number of contradictory or countervailing judicial opinions from dueling environmental and regulated communities' citizen suits. This is where I ought to at least get a rise out of Jack and many of you. I also think it suffers from a biased science. I am in love with conservation biology, and it is absolutely the critical discipline in order to be able to make the Endangered Species Act work and to recover species. However, I have to say it is a scientific discipline without discipline. Perhaps unique among the sciences, the discipline makes no pretense of objectivity. When you read its credos, its publications, etc., it makes it clear that its mission is not just to study causes of extinction and means of recovery, but to champion recovery in all available public policy arenas. And the concern is that, yes, you are to err on the side of the species, but that should be in the final decisions. That shouldn't be in the research, and it shouldn't be in the scientific analysis. And there's a real fear, at least in the regulated community, that because of this mission of conservation biology, that the erring may begin early. And if you have any doubt about my view on this, you should read the next slide at your leisure. You can't read it up here, which is a quote from the father, acknowledged father of conservation biology, Reed Noss, which I and many others find very scary. Due process infirmities. I'm the unknown commentator he mentioned when he said, that Dale mentioned when he said that it's near secret decision making. You can search in vain for even minimal due process in much of the ESA. Closed door procedures, few hearings, no administrative appeals. I could go on and on. And you compare that to the other environmental laws, and it's really extraordinary. This, again, one of the cases where liberals and conservatives are in absolute agreement the act needs changing. Controlling land uses. The ESA, almost uniquely among environmental laws, relies on or implicates directly land use planning and control. And as one who worked on Scoop Jackson's failed National Land Use Policy Act, I can tell you that there is spontaneous political combustion anytime there's a suggestion that the feds should in any way be engaged, instead of the states and local governments, in land use planning. It's a different scale. Under the ESA, a broad array of projects on millions of acres can be controlled to benefit a single species. We're not just talking, as in most environmental laws, about regulating projects on a site-specific basis or within a discrete airshed or watershed. Agency culture shock, and this comes from every director of the Fish and Wildlife Service with whom I've talked, particularly Jamie Clark under the Clinton administration. The Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS employees have seen their career paths veer from field work to paperwork. They were trained in the former and they are now learning the latter. And it's a simple fact that the Fish and Wildlife Service and NIMS lack a stable and mature regulatory culture similar to EPA or the Corps of Engineers. They're learning on the fly. And of course, they lack the resources compared to EPA and the Corps of Engineers, as Dale emphasized. There's also appearance of a failed law. We all know it takes more than 35 years, or even less, depending on when a species was listed, to recover a species. But that doesn't affect the critics. And the critics all point out that 25 domestic species in 3 decades are all that have been recovered, whereas a greater number have been delisted to correct data or acknowledge extinctions. That's an unfair test, but it's there. Some of the others are not unfair when you talk about a failed law. Only 38% of listed domestic species have designated critical habitat. Dale points to 2 statistics in his paper that are just astonishing. It takes an average of 11 years now between the petition to list the species and to have it listed, where the statute says that's supposed to be done in 2 years. And we have 280 and growing species on the candidate species list, and it takes 17 years, I believe, to get a species off of that list and listed. And in fact, in the process, 27 species have gone extinct while they've been sitting on the candidate species list. A tardy beginning, leaving numerous unresolved issues. This statute went from 0 to 60 in 2 long decades. We didn't have any substantial litigation under the ESA until the early 1990s, and that was because my belief is there was an absolute backlog of unresolved issues that just exploded. And because litigation has started so late, their major ESA provisions remain uninterpreted and suffer from contradictory or ambiguous interpretations by the courts. And there's been virtually no effort to embody court decisions in new rulemakings. Well, now we come to the climate change element. And the polar bear listing and the questions it poses on how to address climate change under the ESA only exacerbate the ESA's unstable position. I'll give you, and it certainly has increased exponentially the fears of the regulated community that the pit bull will slip its leash. It's got leash there. No one can, I'll give you an example of George Will, who doesn't normally speak in hyperbole, but boy did he hear. And when he talked about the polar bear, he said that the Endangered Species Act might become what New Dealers wanted the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933 to be, authority to regulate almost everything. Some environmental advocates have fueled those fears. I give you a quote from Kiernan Suckling of the Center for Biological Diversity that says ESA with climate change puts firm legal foundation for challenging global warming pollution. I also give you quotes of other environmentalists that recognize the limitations of the ESA. The quote that I find most interesting is from John Kostiak, the General Counsel of the National Wildlife Federation, and Professor Dan Rolfe at the Lewis and Clark Law School. And that quote, and I'll only read in part, is while it's important to acknowledge the vast array of actions that threaten biodiversity by contributing to climate change, casting such a broad net also poses a danger of overwhelming the service's programs. The second quote from Carl Broch in the Environmental Forum, the ELI publication, existing laws is mostly incapable of responding effectively to the breadth and severity of climate change. In the coming years, the Endangered Species Act could grind to a halt. There is not even a consensus on the scientific and land management communities on how the ESA should be employed in the face of climate change. Should we intervene to assist adaptation? And are we assisting the migration of species to newly hospitable habitats? Or are we assisting invasive species to enter new habitats in which they are inhospitable to the habitat? Or do we let natural selection take its course? What do we do about no analog ecosystems? The quote on that is astonishing. Doug Fox says, if the climate changes over the next 100 years, as current models predict, surviving species throughout much of the Earth's land area will not simply migrate north and south en masse in unchanging communities. Instead, they are likely to be reshuffled into novel ecosystems unknown today. Then the task of preparing for or even predicting the ecological effects of climate change just got a whole lot harder. There are analytical nightmares. Every time you consult on a federal agency action, do you have to run the models to determine what the incremental effects of GHG emissions of each project will be for the polar bear in the Arctic and the elkhorn and staghorn coral in the Caribbean? And if you do all that analysis, do you really come up with reasonable and prudent measures that have a beneficial effect sufficient to warrant the cost? And I'm not going to go through the legal nightmares because my time is short, but I will just say that there are, and I ask you to take a look at it, significant problems in establishing causation in order to be able to let the ESA run freely in assisting in stopping global climate change. And I'll end the climate change section before I get to the legislative one by simply saying that, again, quoting Kostiak, the General Counsel of National Wildlife Federation, that simply said that there really, I quote him as saying it would overwhelm the act. He proposes a streamlined programmatic method for ensuring ESA compliance. And normally that could be done, as Dale said, administratively. But unfortunately, the only way it can be done here is to have the emitter certify compliance with applicable national capping programs. And of course, that requires legislation. People who know me know that I could consume the time of a dozen panels suggesting changes to the ESA that I think would be adopted freely by moderate elements of both the regulated and environmental community. But time allows me for only one message. The most significant, truly effective changes will come with legislation, but they can't be amending, reforming, modernizing, whatever you want to call it, the ESA itself. That's a thankless and unproductive path. Let me give you just two examples very quickly. One of them, already mentioned, is S1100 and S1180 in 1997 and 1999. In fact, it included one of the provisions that Dale suggested, which was to move the recovery plan from listing to, critical habitat from listing to the preparation of the recovery plan. That went through the Senate committee with only one dissenting vote. It had the support of the future majority leader, Mr. Reid, the future Finance Committee Chair, Mr. Baucus, the future Secretary of the Interior, Kemp Thorne, the Clinton administration, organized labor, moderate segments of the environmental and regulated community. A breeze, right? No. It was killed in the Senate by opposition from environmental activists, and it was killed in the House by opposition from property rights advocates. The left and the right both opposed a very consensus bill. If you look at the infamous Pombo bill, which passed in 2005 with really controversial provisions to appease property rights advocates, what people often don't notice is the Miller-Boehlert substitute, the environmental substitute, lost by a scant 10 votes. And both Miller and Boehlert said on the Senate floor that the language in their bill was 80 to 90% identical to the Pombo bill. And despite this entirely unnoticed unanimity in the House on significant changes to the ESA, not a single ESA bill was introduced in the Senate and not a single hearing was held. So the lesson, efforts to legislate on the ESA itself are unrewarding. My final point, however, is that ESA-related legislative change is not foreclosed. Instead, opportunities are ample. My view is forget the ESA, cast a wider legislative net. Incorporate provisions to assist and protect imperiled species in other bills. Bills that, if not safer, have larger and broader constituencies and much greater political focus and inertia. Bills in which the species provisions can thrive in the shade of provisions with greater societal and economic impacts. This year it was the Farm Bill. We almost got the first permanent funding for the ESA through the Farm Bill. We still have a major provision providing landowners can deduct the costs of taking actions that are recommended in recovery plans. Next Congress, we have the real opportunity with the climate change and energy bills. And not only do these bills convenient vehicles, they're also addressing some of the greatest threats to species. So that's my view and my hope. Any effort to recast or bolster the ESA legislatively is prone to failure. That's the premise, not the message. The premise is pessimistic, the message is optimistic. Today, environmentalists counsel us to think globally. I'd settle for an astutely expansive legislative agenda. You can build through multiple legislative vehicles and obtain salient and salutary change. To torture the analogy one last time, we'll go back to the pit bull. And the legislative change we seek ought to prevent the pit bull from becoming either a noble show dog with an impressive or remarkable appearance and an unremarkable conduct, or an ignoble attack dog with fierce, frenetic behavior that is ultimately self-destructive. Instead, it should enable this current canine to serve as a steadfast and tireless guard dog for all imperiled species and their habitats. Thank you.
All right. Every now and then it's good to take stock and keep track of where we are in the process. Where we are in the process, this is the autumn of 2008. It will long be remembered as the season of the pit bull. The pit bull is getting more airtime this season than any other animal, and Steve has found another way to bring it into the public dialogue. Speaking of pit bulls, a convenient segue, Jack Tuholsky is going to express outrage and indignation at every one of Steve's comments.
Not every one of them. And I would like to thank the moderator for letting me know that I've been included on this panel for diversity reasons, because this is the first time I've had such an honor, and I'm not going to even inquire as to what diversity I might add, other than I may have less gray hair or more hair. So today's topic is reforming the Endangered Species Act. Does the Endangered Species Act need to be reformed? No. Thank you very much. Any questions? I think that there can be and there needs to be a legitimate debate about improving the Endangered Species Act. But before that can happen, I think that 4 things need to occur before we can really even put it on the table and have a sensible discussion about this law. And I'm going to talk about those in some detail. But the 4 points that I think need to be addressed first, number 1, that we have to debunk certain myths about the ESA. Number 2, that we have to celebrate the successes of the ESA, including delisting. Number 3, we have to fund the agency, fund the agency, fund the agency. We're starting to sound like a broken record, and I think it is remarkable that we can have a panel like this, and you're getting that same message from all of us. And finally, I think we have to restore trust in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and we have to depoliticize the agency and the decisions that it makes. And until we can do all 4 of those things, I don't think we can have an intelligent debate about how we can improve or reform the ESA. And I think the legislative gridlock underscores the fact that until we resolve some of these underlying issues, that change is going to be very difficult. So debunking the myth. What are the myths? Well, first of all, I think we need to step back for a second and say, okay, the the debate about whether or not the Endangered Species Act is a good idea is over. But I think a lot of people under the guise of reform are really trying to have a debate about, whether as a society we should, put critters over human needs in certain circumstances or not. And we can have that debate if we need to. But in my view, we ended that debate when we passed the Endangered Species Act, and the fact that the law is still on the books is proof positive that as a society we have made the decision that we want to protect species before they go extinct, and so we need to recognize that we have made that decision. Nonetheless, these myths that I think are mostly collateral attacks, going back to sort of the soul and purpose of the ESA, continue to permeate the debate. And I just want to throw out a couple of them here. The first one being is that the ESA is a roadblock to human progress. And I want to point you to a study by the World Wildlife Fund that looked at 100,000 consultations in a 5-year period, found that 95,000 of those, so 95% of those consultations, were rapid and informal with no delay or modifications to the project. Of the remaining, there were only 352 jeopardy opinions, and a total of 54 out of 100,000 projects were actually terminated. And so this myth that the endangered species is a roadblock to human progress is not borne out by a serious study of the Act. The second myth that I think needs to be debunked, and there's some information about this in Professor Goebel's handout materials, is that the ESA has these dire economic consequences, and that we got to get rid of the ESA because it is retarding economic growth in this country. And that simply is not true. You do not hear Ben Bernanke going to Congress and saying, give me $700 billion and for God's sakes delist the grizzly bear so we can get this country back on track again. You're not hearing the CEO of Lehman Brothers say, God, if you guys only hadn't listed the links, all my junk bonds would have been just fine. So big picture, the ESA is a non-player in our national economic growth. And the fact is, since 1973, this country has enjoyed remarkable economic prosperity despite the Endangered Species Act. So let's look at the ESA on a micro level, if you will. And there certainly are situations where the ESA has financially affected somebody. I'm not trying to deny that there are not situations where the ESA has affected a particular development. But the mythology that is put out by those opposed to the Endangered Species Act does a disservice to that notion and mostly is a pack of lies. And I will refer you to the Montanans for Multiple Use website that has a number of, it's got a page saying we got to reform, get rid of the ESA, and it's got a page that has a number of these like ESA horror stories, and they're the same ones that get repeated over and over again, and they're basically not true. One of them concerns a hospital in San Bernardino County, California. This very charismatic megafauna called the Delhi sand-loving fly, a species that just brings tears to my eyes, but nonetheless is listed, and did cause some delay in the construction of this hospital. But the hospital was ultimately built. It's doing fine. It's helping people, so people are not dying because we tried to protect this fly. There's another story that's told about the failure of a levee in California, the Abragoba levee, that according to the Montanans for Multiple Use website, that the levee broke, flooding 500 homes, 9,000 acres of prime farmland, caused 3 people to die, and that came about because of the longhorn elderberry bark beetle, another charismatic megafauna. And it turns out that that is simply not true, that is a myth. And in fact, the California Assembly, Water, Parks, and Wildlife Committee conducted hearings to determine the cause of the levee break, and they concluded, quote, that the California and federal Endangered Species Acts and other environmental laws did not contribute to the levee failure of 1997. And so we have this mythology that is perpetrated that I think the air needs to be cleared, and we need to get rid of these myths before we can really have an intelligent debate about the Endangered Species Act. My second point is that I think we need to celebrate the successes of the Endangered Species Act. And I think that the ESA is one of America's great contributions to the world. I think that it is something that as Americans we should be proud of. I'm in the process of getting little lapel pins with an American flag and an ESA and a bald eagle made up, and I hope that Stephen will wear one, and I certainly think it should be a litmus test for our presidential candidates. But we don't celebrate the ESA enough. You know, the bald eagle, our national symbol, the peregrine falcon, the gray whale, there are some wonderful success stories, and I think we need to embrace those, and that should cut across the political spectrum. The third point I want to make is that the Endangered Species Act needs to be fully funded, and I think it needs to be fully funded for a decade before we can decide whether the present configuration of Section 7 and the relationship of critical habitat designation to recovery plans, and I think those are good ideas that have been thrown out in terms of things we have to look at to make this act better, because you know, I give Section 4 to my students as an exercise in statutory construction, and then I have a wonderful time needling them for an hour and a half to try to get them to figure out how the heck you actually list or delist a species. I mean, it's a mess. The process needs to be streamlined. The relationship between critical habitat and recovery is vital, and the statute doesn't do a good job of setting that up. And so I think we can talk about those things, but in my view, before we do that, we need to fund the agency so that we can get rid of this backlog of listing and critical habitat designations and really see how this statute functions in a climate that is not so overtly politicized. And that leads me to my fourth point, is that we have to restore trust in the agency, and we have to depoliticize the Fish and Wildlife Service before we can move forward and talk about reform. And in saying that, I want to be critical of both parties, because I don't think that the problems of the Endangered Species Act, I mean, I think it's, you know, there's some serious problems right now, and it's easy to focus on how the Bush administration has dealt with the ESA. And I'm not a Washington insider, so I may be wrong about some of this, but when the references were made to Secretary Babbitt, you know, not liking critical habitat, I mean, I think that's kind of a true fact. And in fact, under the Clinton administration, the ESA was not funded in a manner that really was a whole lot better than is being funded right now. And Secretary Babbitt did not like critical habitat, so he didn't designate it, and he didn't fund the service and didn't seek the funding to comply with the law. And so you get, you know, a crush of lawsuits over critical habitat because of a political agenda based upon a belief, and, you know, whether it's a good or a bad belief is irrelevant, because the fact is that the law sets up a process for the designation of critical habitat, and when you don't seek the funding to implement the law, you are politicizing, you know, what should be an agency that is primarily devoted to, you know, the science of protecting and recovering wildlife. And so I really think that we have to look at depoliticizing the Fish and Wildlife Service, and certainly the last 8 years have brought that home to roost, and in my view, have crippled the trust that a lot of people have in the Fish and Wildlife Service, at least the interested communities of organizations and government people that are involved in species protection. You know, the Julie McDonald debacle was, you know, is something that frankly is shameful, to have appointed someone who has no scientific background, who comes in on a mission to basically monkey wrench the Endangered Species Act and personally meddles in scientific decisions, causes many fine people to leave the Fish and Wildlife Service causes the agency to get hammered in court time and time again because of a political agenda, an opposition to the act in principle has led to, I think, a horrible loss of trust and a demoralization within the agency. And so my message to the next president of this country is not to infuse the agency with a particular ideology. If it's an Obama administration, I have no doubt that environmental groups are going to say, well, okay, it's time for a payback, and I think that that would be a huge mistake because you would politicize the agency in another way, and that will not get us into the realm of being able to have an intelligent debate about the Endangered Species Act. Finally, I think as part of celebrating our successes and depoliticizing the agency and restoring trust to the agency, that we should not fear delistings, but at the same time that they should not be done for political reasons. And I think the recent wolf delisting case is a good example of that. The Fish and Wildlife Service in, I think it was 2003 or 2004, basically denied delisting efforts by the state of Wyoming because Wyoming still labeled wolves as predators in most of the state, and Wyoming was responding to a bunch of chest thumping that, it's time we get to go out and start blasting wolves. And that's what we do in Wyoming, so we got to delist them and we got to call them predators. And the Fish and Wildlife Service said, no, your plan, and this is a simplified version of a pretty complicated case, but the Fish and Wildlife Service basically said, we're not going to buy into that. You have got to create a recovery plan here that protects wolves from, wanton killing in vast portions of your state, because as well as we do, they're starting to load the .6, and the day you sign delisting, people are going to go out and they're going to start killing wolves, and the only reason wolves got listed, not because of habitat loss, not because of anything but human-driven mortality. And so if we don't continue to address that problem, we shouldn't delist them. And the service held firm, and a couple years later, the service flip-flopped, and they dressed it up and said, well, Wyoming has modified its position and yada, 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 but it didn't. It was a political decision, and they went ahead with the delisting, and now we see the result of contentious federal court suit, an injunction by a federal judge overturning the delisting, an agency that, in my view, is pretty much going to have to go back to the drawing board. And that's just one example. I'd love to talk about grizzly bear delisting, but that case is now live in front of Judge Malloy, and I am an attorney of record in there, so I'm going to have to mind my P's and Q's on that one. But I see some of the same strands in the grizzly bear delisting, the political undertones that are driving that decision as well. And I think that to restore trust and faith in the agency, we have to do our best to depoliticize it. So, in conclusion, I think that I feel heartened by the fact that I can get up here and I can agree with so many of the things that have been said by the other panelists here. That it is an act that first and foremost is misunderstood by the public, and my solution to that is that we all have an obligation to begin debunking those myths. It's an act that has had successes, and I think we need to celebrate and embrace those successes. This is something that America can give to the world. We are at least trying to come up with a way to protect our heritage. I think we need to fund the agency. We're going to start sounding like a broken record on that point, but that, I think, is the root of many of the problems. And finally, to depoliticize the service and to try to restore the trust that clearly has been lost. Thank you.
I'm going to exercise my prerogative. I'm going to seize the prerogative to ask a couple of questions of the panelists. They'll be allotted 1 minute for each response, leaving time for Oh, come on, guys, you're up to it. Leaving time for questions from the audience. My first question is this. Throughout yesterday's panels, a number of people raised the thesis that forest planning, forest management, the governing legal regime for forest management needs fundamental reconsideration in light of, among other things, climate change and the habitat changes coming with that. If that is true, and if we are about to embark on the process of reconsidering forest management, what should we do with respect to endangered species in that rethinking forest management effort? Mr. Quarles.
They took the microphones away.
Oh.
Good idea.
Can we get one back? I'm not sharing. Come on. I paid for this, Mike.
Well, I think first of all, let me say, I think that national forest planning, BLM planning, et cetera, is probably the greatest opportunity for us to show the American people that the Endangered Species Act really does work. Because when you talk about planning private land, as I said earlier, you always create conflict. But FLIPMA, NFMA, both of which I had the pleasure of drafting as a Senate staffer, glorify planning. I think that's the problem. I think that somebody said, some notable person said that you can't go into battle without planning, but don't have plans. And my view is that the problem right now with NFMA and FLIPMA is that there's an expectation that you will write a plan that will provide certainty or clear guidance for years to come, 15 years in the case of NFMA. And they don't recognize adaptive management. They don't recognize the lack of data we have. Foresters think they had all the data. So do archaeologists, so do many others. But we know there isn't enough data on endangered and threatened species. And I think we need to work on regulations, not on the statute, that make the plans less formal, permanent documents and that glorify adaptive management, set up a monitoring system, and ensure that adaptive management occurs.
Professor Goebel.
I think I agree with a lot of what Steve said. I think that planning in the face of global climate change is going to be extremely difficult. If you've looked much at what the scientists are saying is about to happen, it is that things are just going to come apart. Species in habitats are in habitats because they interact with different chunks of the climate. And as the climate changes, those bits and pieces of climate go different places. So things that are now grouped together into habitats are likely to go all over the place as the particular part of the climate that they're interacting with most significantly moves. And it doesn't move uniformly. 15-year plans can't deal with that kind of thing. We clearly have to increase the concern for biodiversity when the federal agencies plan for what they're going to do. But we have to get really light on our feet at this point. We have to be able to move fairly quickly.
Jack.
I think that, frankly, the federal government, the land use planning agencies are suffering from a case of schizophrenia when it comes to land use planning. Because on the one hand, we say that, and I do agree that the land use plans are probably the best vehicle to try to address. And I do agree that we have to be light on our feet, and I'm not categorically opposed to adaptive management. But at the same time, the Forest Service and the BLM have been very successful at the U.S. Supreme Court, getting the Supreme Court to say pretty much that these plans don't mean a darn thing. And given, again, I think the lack of trust to have plans that are supposedly going to protect these species from the ill effects of climate change, but at the same time, the plans don't mean anything, they're not binding, they're entirely discretionary. It creates a catch-22 situation. And so I agree that the old notion of forest plans, where you have this, 30% elk effectiveness habitat standard set in stone for 20 years, is not the kind of forest plan that's going to be nimble enough to deal with what has been called a no analog future, something we don't have the tools to address. But at the same time, if we're going to have these forest plans, I think they have to mean something. I think they have to have some type of standard or yardstick that is enforceable and can withstand the politicization that inevitably occurs when you're dealing with public land issues.
All right, one more question, then we'll turn it over to the audience. Again, 1 minute for each answer. Jack, hold on to the mic.
Can't the smart guys go first?
We're doing it that way this time. The Democrats are on a march. The Democrats are retaking the high ground in the West. Democratic senators are taking over seats held for decades by resource extractive-oriented Western Republicans. We've got a likelihood of a stronger Democratic majority in the House and the Senate, improving odds daily of a Democratic president. What does it mean that Western Democrats that there are more of them, they're in higher office, and they're entering a period of political power for the purpose of the Endangered Species Act?
I think that prospect offers hope in terms of shifting the debate into one that is real and to start debunking the myths, because in my biased view, a lot of those myths were driven by very conservative Republicans who had, frankly, I think, a broader agenda to reshape society than simply, the Endangered Species Act, which became a favorite whipping boy.
Dale.
I'm currently living in a blue state, but my home's a red state. It's the reddest state in the country, as a matter of fact. So I don't see the changes that you are arguing for. I think that dividing the world into Democrats and Republicans tends not to be a useful way to talk about this. Western Democrats would be Republicans in the East. So I'm not sure that just saying that they're, Western Democrats also support hunting and gun rights, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not sure of the division that way. The change, I think, will be, though, that the leadership of the House and the Senate will be more secure in what they can do.
Steve.
I also have the same sense, and part of that is because my view is that whatever damage you can say that this administration did, particularly with the Julia McDonald debacle, we're not. My view is that the Endangered Species Act is in the same position, virtually the same position it was as at the end of the Clinton administration. There has been one solicitor's opinion on the Endangered Species Act, and that's on how you define portion of its range when you list a species in a portion of its range. And that disappointed the regulated community and the environmental community equally. It was a nothing solicitor's opinion. And we have seen no major effort to reform the regulations by this administration of the Endangered Species Act. In fact, their first two attempts at regulations are coming out right now, and there's a serious question whether they will survive. So I don't really believe, except for increasing the candidate species list, losing the opportunity to designate more critical habitat and more species, has this administration really ended up, whatever its intent, to do any real significant damage to the ESA. And I share the view of a lot of people that it's just not high on the agenda of the next administration, Democrat or Republican. And that's why I think the best opportunity for any significant change is just because some of the major legislative vehicles, like the Energy Act and the Climate Change Act, will ultimately have to address species as well, and that's serendipitous almost.
Thank you. Very, very interesting. All right, questions from the floor. A hand in front. And the mic is on its way here.
I would like to have Jack, I can't pronounce, is this the word?
If you talk into it straight.
Huh?
Aim it at your
Okay.
face.
How's that?
Yep.
Jack, and I can't pronounce his last name.
No one else can.
Let the record reflect.
Talk
He's
about
referring to
what-
Jack Tucholsky.
Talk about forest planning some more, and explain to everybody just how the forest planning that was tried to be accomplished in a couple of years ago, it was 1906, was for more flexible, less demanding guidance type of thing, and then individual projects would go through the NEPA process rather than the whole thing. That got shot down because the whole planning process did not go through the NEPA process. And maybe you could discuss that and see where we're at. I hear some people that didn't like that whole idea and condemned the Forest Service for suggesting it. I was involved in it, and I thought it was a pretty good deal.
Jack.
Okay.
Please step up.
The question has to do, if I understand it, is with the 2005 Bush administration regulations that basically said that forest plans are just mere guidance and that we're going to deal with things at the project level. And my problem with that is twofold. I think, first of all, that on a sort of a legal scholarly level that the National Forest Management Act was meant forest plans to mean something. And I think as we enter into this unknown future, if you will, that the plans should be a basis that is more than simply laudatory or guidance, that the plans have to set the sideboards. They can be flexible sideboards, but they have to have some teeth. And as the forest plans were put out under the Bush administration's first rules, they couldn't even have standards. So they couldn't have any provision in there that had teeth. And I think that that agencies need to have those firm sideboards. Now, there can be flexibility built into that, and I do think ultimately the devil's in the detail when you come down to a project-by-project analysis. But in terms of planning, when we have this broad landscape-level problem of climate change, that forest plans can and should play a role, and the way they do that is by having some meaningful standards.
Steve, you want to respond?
Not really to respond, but I think there has to be a happy middle, and I'm not sure that it's been established yet. But I can recall the last administration's forest planning regulations with the Committee of Scientists, and when I counted up, and when GAO counted up, for any single project to make it through the process, extractive, recreational, whatever, you had to really go through about 8 or 9 different standards that have been put into the planning regulations by the Committee of Scientists. And I'm going to sound like a regulatory demon when I say that, when I say it up to now, but my next statement may make a little bit of difference. And that is those that were most opposed to the Forest Service planning regs that were so detailed in the last administration were, in fact, the Secretary of the Interior and John Leshy. And they refused to have the BLM write corresponding regulations because of just what we've talked about today. That plans, whether you'd say they have guidance or teeth, it doesn't matter, have to be schematic. They have to be flexible. And they can't just be glorious books that are placed on a shelf and become obsolete within a very short period of time. So you even saw that debate in the last administration, and 2 very prominent environmentalists being very, very opposed to the kind of complicated planning regs that were part of the Clinton administration's Forest Service.
Thanks. Other questions? Back. Yes, you. I'm sorry. I missed. Yes, please.
I have 2. Is that
You're who I
okay?
meant. We're running short on
Okay,
time.
they'll
Can you
be
do
really
one?
fast ones.
Okay.
In the past, also, we've all talked about Fish and Wildlife Service funding, and the Forest Service has had to change the color of the money to pay them in some places for consultation work. So are we heading down a road of contracting out Fish and Wildlife Service consultation? And also, this best science thing in the last decade has made a really entertaining court cases. But with climate change, who's got the best science?
Who wants to take?
Available.
Yeah, Vail. The
Best
consult.
available science.
So if we all have science, who's best?
That's what you ask the scientists for. I mean,
Well, I'm going to respond to a small part of your question. If you think that the guts of the consultation process isn't already farmed out, you're wrong. We who represent folks who need consultations end up organizing, arranging, and paying for most of the science. And it's subject to review by the agencies, but a large part of the budget of any substantial project, in terms of permitting, where you've got species, is spent on the hydrologists, biologists, the other folks who do the work for the feds, in effect. And so there is a privatization already underway, and it's been that way for some time. Jack?
And just to add to what Dale said, it is the best available science, and I want to take my litigator hat on here because I know I'm being filmed, take it off, and put on a professor hat and say that, you know, in the real world, the agency is going to get a fair bit of deference when it uses the best available science. And if it doesn't keep its head in the sand, it is going to have a fair bit of discretion to decide between competing studies, you know, which ones it's going to use in its decision.
That's right. Other questions? Yes. You get another shot at it here.
It's interesting that we're having this panel discussion today because this afternoon the Senate Environment and Public Works Committee is holding an oversight hearing into the Bush administration's proposed rules to seriously weaken Section 7. And in a nutshell, basically, these rules would give action agencies like the BLM or the Department of Transportation the opportunity to basically self-consult instead of going through the process with Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA. And I'm wondering what the panelists think of this idea of allowing agencies to self-consult.
Anyone want to take that? Steve?
First of all, let me say that it doesn't allow the agencies to self-consult. What it does is, the Act doesn't do this, but the regs do this. The regs set up 3 different categories. If an action agency makes a no may affect decision, that its action will not affect, then it doesn't have to consult at all. If it makes a not likely to adversely affect, then it does informal consultation with the services, and all the services have to do is write a 1-page letter saying we agree. It's only if it makes a decision that it's likely to adversely affect do they go through formal consultation with a biological opinion, incidental take statement, reasonable and prudent measures. What these regs would do would be to move the consultation requirement one step towards the more seriously threatening actions. It would not only allow the action agencies to make a no may affect decision without consulting, but it would remove the informal consultation in some instances, when the agency could make a not likely to adversely affect decision and the services would not comment. I think that except for some really stupid things like setting deadlines on the informal consultation, I don't think it's nearly as serious a undermining of the bill, of the Act, as some people think. The standards are that you can't see even one potential for one take of any single member of a species. If you see the potential for one take, then it has to go into formal consultation. And not only that, that's the predicate. You also have to meet one of 5 other criteria. So I don't see it as a tremendous undermining, and I'll give you an example. Michael Bean of the Environmental Defense Fund has long proposed that if there's a long-term, clear conservation benefit from particular actions, why is it necessary to go through consultation for things like safe harbor agreements and others? And this doesn't even help Michael, because you will always have the potential for a take in the short-term effect when you're trying to rehabilitate riparian areas or do whatever it is for long-term conservation. Having said that, there would be a number of major changes I would make in it if it survived at all. And I would make it very clear that the services could pull back the informal consultation procedure at any time that where they do periodic reviews, they discover that the action agency is not properly performing. But I'm not as worried about it, because I think it actually, with the few resources that the services have, I think they ought to focus on formal consultation where the actions are clearly likely to adversely affect the species. It's not a popular position, but it's one that I think is realistic given the resources of the services at this point.
Jack is going to have a comment, and then we're going to wrap it up. We're right on schedule.
One caveat is that Fish and Wildlife Service adopted what are called counterpart regs, where they turned it over to the action agencies in a handful of situations, and a review of that process led to the conclusion that the action agencies were not doing a good job on informal consultation, which raises some sort of red flags, I think.
Yeah, 2 points here. First of all, I think that the fact that these regulations are coming out at the 11th hour is, to me, a good indication that they are politically driven, and we're not going to have time to really have an informed debate. And I think, big picture, the ESA sets up a tension between the Fish and Wildlife Service and the action agencies, and that's one of its strengths, is that it's a check and balance, if you will. And so to the extent that we're trying to water that tension down, I don't think it does service to the ultimate purposes of the Act.
All right, thank you, everybody. We've used our time, every minute of it. Thanks for being a good audience.